It's been 4 years since the GROM has been updated, but today Honda announced changes to the super popular miniature motorcycle. It's had a significant visual reworking, but also a few changes under the hood as well. So in today's video, we'll look over it in some detail and figure out whether it's actually better than the outgoing model. But before we get started, if you're new here and you want to see all of the latest motorcycle news, including new bikes for 2021, then please do remember to hit subscribe. I'll be covering as many of them as physically possible over the next couple of months, so subscribe to see those videos as soon as they go live. First up, there's been a slight adjustment to the name. It's always been the GROM in the US, but in other markets like the UK and Europe, it's been known as the MSX125. For 2021, it'll now be known internationally as a combination of the two, the MSX125 GROM. It's easy to understand why Honda made this change, as it's a bit of a cult bike and the GROM name has been affectionately adopted across the globe. Honda say that it sells particularly well with young riders and that they've sold an incredible 750,000 units since its introduction in 2013. That's a huge number, more than most motorcycle manufacturers sell across their whole range in a year. Incidentally, they say that the GROM name is derived from the word being used in the 60s to describe young surfers, which is something I never knew until today. Engine performance will remain pretty much the same for the new model year, with a peak power of 7.2 kilowatts or just under 10 horsepower, although it is produced 250 RPM higher in the rev range than the previous model at 7,250. There's also a shade less peak torque with 10.5 Newton meters compared to the 10.9 of the previous generation, although it is produced at the same 5,500 RPM. These are probably not particularly noticeable differences when you're riding a small bike at this power level, and they're most likely down to the fact that Honda will have had to make some changes in order to get the engine to pass the upcoming Euro 5 emissions regulations, which come into effect at the beginning of next year. Reworking the engine can be expensive, so most manufacturers resort to adding more substance to the exhaust system in order to reduce emissions, and that sometimes can negatively affect power output as well as add weight. That might be a contributing factor to the extra 1.5 kilograms of the new GROM, with a 103 kilogram curb weight to the 101.5 of the last generation. That's still super light and should be easily manageable for the younger beginner riders that Honda has typically attracted with this bike so far. Perhaps more significant than the small differences in output is the addition of an extra gear. The previous generation only had 4, whereas the new model will get a 5-speed gearbox. Firstly, this means a bit of extra top speed, going from 57 miles per hour to 59, but also Honda say that they've been able to use closer ratios, which ought to give a bit more zip under acceleration. Something that wasn't mentioned in the press release, but that I spotted from comparing the spec sheets for the two models, is that the fuel tank is now quoted as having a 6-litre capacity, whereas the old model had 5.5 litres. You might have thought that they'd do this to compensate for worse fuel efficiency owing to some of the changes that they've made, but fuel consumption figures look the same, so although they've not made a big deal out of it, it looks like you might get an extra 20 miles of range out of a tank. The dash has been updated, and although it looks relatively similar to the outgoing model, there are a couple of small additions. Firstly, it looks like fuel consumption will be displayed, which can sometimes be useful if you're running low, and there's also now a gear position indicator. Although I wouldn't say it's absolutely necessary for this type of bike, given that newer riders are the target market, it can be useful whilst you're learning to ride. The press release also states that ABS is now powered by an IMU or inertial measurement unit. Nowadays, IMUs are associated with lean-sensitive rider aids like ABS and traction control, but there's no mention of that from Honda, and so it's probably the same system that's on their other small capacity bikes like the CB300R. In the literature for that bike, Honda say that both brakes are modulated by 2-channel ABS that works through an IMU to give precise front to rear distribution of ABS operation depending on vehicle behavior. So again, a nice little update, especially for the less experienced rider. But perhaps the biggest update for 2021 is the revised style in which Honda call retro cool. It's not retro in the sort of Triumph Bonneville sense, but more the 80s vibe of something like the Suzuki V-Strom, which was updated last year. New features include a redesigned LED headlight, a new seat unit and subframe, a gold finish to the upside-down forks, and a yellow shock spring which Honda say will stand out in bright contrast to the blacked-out engine, exhaust, wheels and swing arm. But the real talking point on this bike is the bodywork, with a new squared-off look and the ability to swap it out easily. Because the customization scene is so strong amongst GROM owners, Honda appear to have leaned into it by making the bodywork easy to remove and swap by just using 6 bolts on either side, highlighted by the large bolt surrounds. These are a bit of a styling point in their own right, and at first glance I wasn't that keen on them, perhaps because they reminded me of skateboard wheels. But I must admit, over the course of producing this video, they've started to grow on me. More and more motorcycles are currently being produced with plastic panels as opposed to legitimate metal fuel tanks, and I wonder if we'll see other manufacturers follow suit in the coming years. Accessories can offer another lucrative revenue stream for them, and for the consumer, these panels will allow them to really change the look of their bike. In fact, presumably for a couple of £100, you'll be able to swap between 2 sets of bodywork with minimal labour and feel like you own 2 different looking bikes. Indian took a similar approach recently with their FTR 1200, having a handful of well-known artists design side panels as optional accessories. Personally, I really like this idea, and I hope that Honda put out some more daring designs for the GROM beyond a couple of flat colour options. But as always, I'd love to know what you think of it down in the comments below. Do you like the new blocky look, or do you prefer the old GROM with its slightly more futuristic appearance? And what do you make of those removable body panels? Let me know down in the comments below. And if you're new here and you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe and I'll catch you next time.